Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Saturday, March 30th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Akron game in 154 days, the game against Michigan in 245 days, the student appreciation practice, which marks the halfway point of the Ohio State spring football schedule, is today. We will be out there. Our whole crew will be out there covering that. It's a big day in terms of the spring and kind of a milepost in terms of where guys are and in terms of the progression during the spring and all that. It's also a really big recruiting weekend for Ohio State, bringing in Marc Givler of BuckeyeHuddle.com to talk about a bunch of that recruiting stuff. Mark, I guess let's start, before we get to the student appreciation practice and all the visitors for this weekend, got to talk about the decommitment of wide receiver Javon Boggs earlier in the week. That was, I think, a little bit of a surprise. What do you make of that? What was behind that decision?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise because he had been kind of saying all the right things lately and was an early commit, and this was kind of the school I think he envisioned himself at, when the process began. So it was a bit of a surprise to me. At the end of the day, I think he wanted to take visits. Now, why did he want to take visits? I guess that's only he can answer that. Was it, partially because of what Ohio State's got going on at receiver recruiting, which I'm sure we're going to dive into here in a minute. But, he wanted to take visits. Ohio State doesn't have a strict no visit policy, but they weren't too thrilled about that idea. And I think everyone came out of those conversations, deciding it was just best for him to open up his recruiting process. And I expect Ohio State to probably move on at this point, but you never know.
Well, if you had to make a list of positions where Ohio State would be relatively well equipped to bounce back from a decommitment, wide receiver would probably be right at the top of that list. And would you look at this? They have a 5-star wide receiver coming in to visit just this weekend. Several wide receivers coming in, but I wanted to talk specifically to you about Alabama decommit 5-star wide receiver Jamie French. That's French with 2 F's at the beginning. I can't wait for him, if he does end up at Ohio State, to screw up my spell check forever. That'll be great. But let us know a little bit, other than screwing up my spell check, let everyone know a little bit about Jamie French and where he is in his recruiting process.
Yeah, so I think Ohio State's in the driver's seat right now, and obviously they were the big beneficiary of him decommitting from Alabama after Nick Saban retired. The question's going to be, when would he maybe decide? I think a lot of people are having high expectations this weekend that maybe they could close this up. My answer to that would be probably not. And I would also follow up with, if he does, that's not going to exactly cool this thing off for the next 8 months. So I think this is a thing where maybe if you're Ohio State, I think you almost want this to maybe drag a little bit. I don't know that you want to be playing defense the next 8 months. But they're in a great spot right now. Brian Hartline's his best relationship. And obviously he's another South Florida Express guy, so we know how good that program has been to Ohio State in recent years. So I like where things stand. This is another good sign having him back on campus. I do want to throw out there, we'll get into some other guys, but I do want to throw out there he is coming up with Vernell Brown, who is also a South Florida Express guy, who I also believe is trending toward Ohio State right now. So having those guys both up there together will be a great thing, especially as we go through this spring and we hear so many good things about Brandon Ennis and Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate.
Yeah, I was going to say the South Florida Express program has been pretty darn good to Ohio State, particularly in the wide receiver room over the last few years. It seems like that could be on the way to becoming a continuing trend. Somewhere where they have not necessarily had quite the same level of success as they have at wide receiver, and that is a pretty high bar, but is at the offensive line position group. Justin Fry has brought in, solid classes, but they've typically been very based on very good Ohio players, but they've not necessarily always been able to bring in that top national guy, that 5-star tackle that it feels like they're always in on this time of year and then always out on when it comes time to put pen to paper in December. So this year's version of that is offensive tackle David Sanders. He's the number 2 overall player in the class out of North Carolina, number 1 tackle in the country. He is visiting this weekend as well. I know he's a name we've talked about on this show a bunch of times in the past, and you've always kind of been a little, we'll kind of see. Getting him back on campus certainly feels like that's a step in the right direction. How many, how far do you have to go? How many more steps in the right direction do they have to go before this becomes something that you're really taking seriously?
Yeah, this is obviously the first step that would have to happen. I think there's several more. And I suspect he probably will take an official visit to Ohio State this summer. But Ohio State's big problem here is geography, and I don't know how you solve that. I mean, they have done this in the past. They've kind of overcome some things geographically where, like Johnny Dixon was kind of a famous one where he was, staying home. I don't think mom wanted him to go far from home. Mom wanted him at Miami. Zach Smith at the time was the primary recruiter, handled that. And then Urban Meyer came down and did the in-home, and they were able to convince mom. And so there are examples of it happening, but the thing I keep coming back to that people keep telling me is that he's very close with his younger siblings. And because of that, is going to probably stay close to home. And that's why you see Clemson and South Carolina and Tennessee and these programs that are, a couple hours away at best, all throughout his top schools list. And Ohio State's kind of an outlier, which I guess shows that Ohio State's doing a great job in one sense, but in another sense, I think is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, unless they can. Where's that Hyperloop? Maybe they can get the Hyperloop fired up between now and the early signing day. Get the Charlotte, Columbus. I don't know, get another Acela train, something like that. But yeah, failing that, we'll see how this goes.
Elon can build a tunnel.
Yeah. When in doubt, build a tunnel. Always a great thing. So we'll see how the David Sanders thing goes. Obviously, getting him back on campus certainly a step in the right direction. Another spot where the Buckeyes would definitely love to have a nice big recruiting class this cycle. Defensive line. They got London Merritt on campus this weekend. This one seems like it's probably a little more optimistic than the David Sanders side.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about London Merritt. I've kind of had him as a mock class, unofficial mock class guy for a long time now. This is going to be, I've lost count of how many times he's been up here. 6 maybe. I mean, this is 5th or 6th time anyway. Going to come back in the summer for an official. They're recruiting him as hard as any defensive player, and he's got that great relationship with Larry Johnson, and I think this is going to be tough for other schools to overcome this one. We talked about David Sanders, maybe Ohio State, maybe being on the outside looking in with a lot of those top schools on his list. I think that's kind of the opposite here. I think a lot of those top schools have a lot of ground to make up on Ohio State, and they don't blow these types of visits very often. So I think they're in a great position right now. And, the one thing I would say about this weekend is I like how they've set this up. I think historically we look at like spring game weekend as like the big weekend. And I'm not saying spring game weekend won't be exciting. It will be. There will be plenty of recruits on campus. But I think they've done a good job here of getting a whole bunch of guys in this weekend before all the hoopla of the spring game, where the coaches have more time, more availability. Maybe the players are in a better position to host versus, that entire Saturday just being dominated by the spring game. So I like the way this has set up for Ohio State to put forth some really good visits here.
All right. And someone who has been known to put forth some pretty good visits over the last year or two is the OG Tim Walton, cornerbacks coach. He has become the Brian Hartline of the defensive side of the ball in terms of recruiting. And at some point, I mean, the way things are trending right now, Brian Hartline might be the Tim Walton of the offense sooner rather than later, because he already has the number 1 corner in the class of 2025, Devin Sanchez, committed. Number 2 corner of the class, Naeem Offord, already committed. Number 10 corner in the class, Blake Woodby, already committed. Now he's got the number 4 corner in the class, Dorian Brew. He's got him on campus this weekend. This feels like a bigger visit than you might think, because Dorian Brew was an Ohio kid, was at Northmont, moved down to Texas, so it's a chance to get him back home to Ohio. How big is this in terms of where Dorian Brew might ultimately end up, and where do you think things are standing and trending with Dorian Brew and the Buckeyes right now?
Yeah, so he was supposed to decide earlier this winter, postponed that. That almost certainly would have been Ohio State at the time. And I think Texas and Oregon, particularly Texas, have really been able to push the last 2 months. But I still like Ohio State here. I still think they're going to hold off those programs. And, getting him back up again is big. I mean, he's been up. I think this will be his second or third time up since he moved to Texas. So he's been doing all the right things on that front. And I think it is important. I think, they're getting to a point where you're not going to turn away a Dorian Brew by any stretch of the imagination, but you're also getting to a point where there are only so many spots left in this defensive backs class. And so if you're Ohio State, you would certainly like to know who's in and who's out as soon as possible, so you can sort of decide on these last few spots. But so I think Ohio State's going to really put on the full court press this weekend with Dorian and take advantage of this opportunity to get back in front of him. But I still, again, I think Texas has made this a little more interesting than we thought it might be a few months ago, but I still like where Ohio State is.
And finally, we talked about Ohio State having number 1 and number 2 corners in the class of 2025 already committed. This weekend, they're going to welcome the number 1 and number 3 safeties in the class of 2025. Number 1, Trey McNutt. Number 3, Fahim Delane. Both guys who have Ohio State at or near the top of their list. Both guys, I mean, how close do either of them have a decision date that you're aware of? I know Fahim Delane was maybe talking about one. Are either of them kind of close to making a decision, and where do you think Ohio State stands with those two guys?
My sense is that neither of them are going to be deciding in the very short term. These visits can change things. Kids can show up and just be like, man, I just want to be here, and I don't care about this other stuff. But Trey and Fahim have been national recruits. They've been going on visits all over the country. I expect that will continue through the summer. And then maybe decisions at that point. It would catch me a little bit by surprise if we saw something like this weekend or coming out of the weekend. But you never know with the way these visits go. Sometimes kids come in with one mindset and leave with a totally different mindset. But I like where Ohio State's at with both of them. My only, as we've sort of watched this class come together, I've always felt they've led for all these guys in the secondary. And the question was going to be, what happens after the first 5 of these guys commit? Does guy number 6 and 7 look around and say, boy, I don't know. That's a pretty crowded room, or, I'm the 5th or 6th guy in this class, but this other school, and, with getting into NIL, I may get more NIL money at this other school because I may be their star defensive recruit, and here I'm just one of 6 or 7 star defensive recruits. So I think there are some things that could play out that maybe would cause Ohio State to get upset on one of these. But right now, for all these guys, I like where they stand. I like where they stand with McNutt, and I like where they stand with Delane.
Too many star defensive recruits. These are the problems you hate to have, Mark. You hate to see it. I'm sure Ohio State hates to see it. I'm sure Ohio State fans hate to see it right now. I'm sure there's a lot they're hating to see these days with the Buckeyes, with a lot of star players returning for the 2025 season. Some big additions to the transfer portal. There's been a lot to talk about this spring. There's a lot to talk about on the recruiting trail, and a great place to talk about all of it is at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Mark is very busy on the recruiting front there. Tony, Kevin, and I have had a very busy spring covering the team. We've got our whole team of X's and O's gurus. We got a very active and fun community on the Huddle board presented by BuckeyeHuddle.com, presented by Jeff Ruby Steakhouse at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We would love to see you there as well. That is a great place to, if you enjoy our shows on YouTube and on podcasts, that is a great place to support our work. Become a member there at BuckeyeHuddle.com. You also get access to all of that great content, all of that great community, and much more, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Make sure you check out our coverage from Saturday's student appreciation practice at the Woody as well. We will be there. I'm going to guess we will do a live show from there if conditions permit and time permits. Should be a lot of stuff to talk about this year's team as well as the recruiting front of things. That'll be coming up on Saturday at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle and BuckeyeHuddle.com. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.